Okay, we're live. Just gonna wait for him to jump on and we can go from there. There he is. Hi, Adam. So go ahead and request to join the live, and there we go. Okay, since it's away from...
Good day, Talia. Good to see you again.
Good morning. How are you?
Oh, man, we're having a gorgeous day. For once, the sun is actually shining again, and there's a real blue sky, like an actual blue one. It's awesome.
An actual blue, as opposed
An
to...
actual blue sky, like that robin egg blue that you grew up with as a little kid that you're like, wait, this looks like a real blue sky. Oh, yeah, it's I
Tell
know.
your kids. You got to tell your kids, because our kids don't know anymore what a real sky looks like.
Oh, yeah. No, my kid, Talia's like, look at that naughty plane when he sees the thing. So they know. They know what real clouds look like and what they don't look
That
like.
naughty plane. I love it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he knows. He yells it out the window to people. He'll be like, hey, ladies, fluoride's poison. Vaccines are poison. I'm like, good kid.
You know what? From the mouth of babes, though.
That's right. I may or may not encourage the behavior. I encourage it completely. But
I mean, you certainly aren't, doing that with them right afterwards.
Yeah, certainly not. But yeah, that's just a side story for the day.
All right. Well, thank you for doing this. I've been
it's
meaning
my
to
pleasure.
talk about this topic. I know it's been weeks since I first mentioned it, and of course, it's a very, very. I mean, the vaccine thing is a very touchy subject. This one is just.
This is a hot potato. Yeah, I've been mentioning, I think, for like 2 years that I was going to put together a whole PowerPoint and everything on it, and I finally got it done. So you're not the only one that kind of slacked on getting it, because it's such a big topic to wrap your mind around that. And for me, when I bring it up, I still have a lot of trauma from it that I recently, the last 48 hours, have been detoxing out of it, and it's been horrible. Like it's hurt of I've got to take a real deep. It's one of those the acceptance of it. It's tough to look back at your life and say, God, look at how much this trauma has destroyed large aspects of my life. And it's been, it's just a real. I had to go spend time alone yesterday and just told my wife, I'm like, listen, I can't be around anybody right now. I got to go deal with this, and this sucks.
The more I look into it too, and the reason, just because briefly, obviously Adam and I we shouldn't have to preface it with this, but this talk is coming from a very non-judgmental place. A lot of this, when it was first brought up to me, I had already had my first son, and I did circumcise my first son because it was just not something I looked into. And the first time that I was told about the dangers that came with it and everything else, okay, I just recall being in the middle of a staircase in my house, and it was my brother and his wife, who they didn't even have kids yet, but they researched everything. They decided to tell me this then, and my first initial response was to completely clam up, to get super defensive, to start, I maybe cursed at them a little bit just with the how dare you, because you can't undo a procedure like that, so don't tell me that. And I had that very response that a lot of these parents who've already vaccinated their kids had, and I found myself, of course, whatever it was, the seed was already planted. And so I did get upset with them. I'm glad that they still talk to me now, because I really lashed out.
Right.
I really lashed out, and I'm being completely honest here. Our second son is not circumcised, and I'm realizing that a lot of this trauma that I know we're going to talk about today, Adam, is not only for the person that had to go through it, but for the regret parents as well. Because once you can't unknow, and it is something that I now realize I'm going to have to deal with. Jeff and I are going to have to deal with this too. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yep. I mirror the stance completely of listen, my mom didn't know any better. I'm sure she's heartbroken over it too. And I mean, so regret parents out there, But there is no judgment here. We've got, the terrorist organizations like the ADA, the CDC, the FDA, the AAP, or whatever whatever these like 3- and 4-letter terrorist organizations are. There's an entire agenda to hide these things from you. I mean, so when you don't know, you can't blame yourself for what you didn't know. And when you know better, you do better. Be like, listen, I've mutilated, myself, and I look back at my life of all the ways it affected me. I still love my mom completely. Like, she, I'm sure she's heartbroken. I'm not going to be calling her up, screaming at her, be like, how freaking dare you? Be like, it's the same thing with the vaccines. If there is an entire agenda and when we get into this, I'll basically kind of lay it out for all of us to say, this is why this is such a protected agenda of this just pure insanity. And just like you said, the knee-jerk reaction. To preface this, to come out before we go anywhere else, like I was making a PowerPoint the other day about it. Just earlier this week, I was making a PowerPoint about it, and I had a picture basically of one of the circumcision rituals of like a dad holding this kid down and this kid being circumcised. And Tolly walked down and saw the picture. He's my 4-year-old son. And I didn't want him to see this. I'm like, oh, son of a bitch. Now I'm going to have this conversation with my kid to basically say, when Daddy says he's working, this is kind of, I'm sorry, Tolly, but I'm trying to save the other kids so that they could be like you. And I basically kind of show him the difference of, like, I showed him what happened on me versus in the picture and whatever else. And his response was very logically be like, oh, I'm going to shoot those naughty guys and we're going to put them in jail. And I'm like, well, that's a logical response, Tolly, but what we really need to do is basically do it the way Jesus would do it, is say, we need to educate people on it because it's not their fault. When you're lied to, you can't hold it against yourself when you didn't know, when there's entire agendas and organizations that literally do everything in their power and then some to trick you into this, and then you're the one stuck with the guilt later because these companies and these organizations, they don't care. It's like they profit from this hugely, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So yes, obviously, parents, if you are a regret parent, please don't think that I'm judging you or, trying to make you feel guilty in any way, shape, or form. I actually want you to forgive yourself. That is the most important thing, because if you didn't know, listen, my heart goes out to you. Like, I can't even imagine just like, people that have vaccinated their kids and then find out later what they've done. That's heartbreaking. I mean, for a parent to come to that and be able to look that in the eye like Talia, for you to go through that process, like you said, that's hard, and that breaks my heart for all of these parents out there. And so that's why I try to take this, as much as I can get very angry at bad ideas for parents that didn't know. Like if you're just, those going through it, be like, I'm going to try to be as gentle as possible with you, but I'm also still very passionate about it because I firsthand going through undoing this trauma it's a lot. And I mean, I'll get into it in a little bit later of kind of what we're going through, but we'll explain some of the other stuff first. So kind of, where would you like me to start with?
Well, I guess we can go over just the quick statistics that anybody could really go ahead and find that still are maybe on the first page or two of Google, just why it would be worth looking into, I'm sure in your PowerPoint presentation that you would know just like the quick,
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to start off with it is we'll kind of go over just the science is the best way to do it. Like, let's just stick to the hard science. We'll go with that. We can take a look at, hold on, let me see, what's the best first one to start with? I guess the best first one to start with is PTSD. Because when they took an infant, there was an actual doctor that they did an MRI brain scan on an infant. Basically, they put him in the MRI machine. They let him sit for a couple of minutes to get a baseline of where was the brain and the levels and everything that was going on. And then they had to use an obsidian scalpel, which is a super sharp stone. It's like what old arrowheads are made out of. It's like a lava rock, so I believe it's called igneous. Anyway, they had to use that because the MRI machine would take the steel scalpel and suck it and stick it to it because it's a magnet. A big magnetic resonating image is what it is. But during the course of like the thing, and I don't even know if the doctor finished doing it or not, but I want to say that maybe it ended up happening, and he completely switched his stance afterwards because he showed that during the course of this happening, there were excessive quantities of PTSD that happened to that infant's brain. And when that infant came back a month later, a year later, or a week later, a month later, and a year later, the brain never went back to its baseline levels. That basically he concluded without a shadow of a doubt that there is massive levels of PTSD that ends up happening, and trauma, like giant quantities of trauma end up happening. Well, this researcher also basically got fired from his job and was threatened to have his research pulled, or they would take his medical license and all this other stuff. And the doctor was like, listen, I can't just throw away these findings. And so the key regions that they found, and this will move into the science a little bit bigger, the key regions that they found were the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala and temporal lobes back there, and then the hippocampus. So the prefrontal cortex of the brain is the one that's involved up here. This is especially susceptible to mercury toxicity, the prefrontal cortex. My mom had 16 mercury fillings removed and then put back in before she got pregnant with me. So I had the mercury toxicity on top of the circumcision trauma that piggybacked with each other. But the prefrontal cortex is basically involved in long-term planning, decision-making, and following through with that. And so we take a look at a lot of this trauma. What it will do is it destroys in the brain, because there is actual physical trauma that will happen from the emotional trauma. The brain will physically damage itself from this deep levels of trauma, and that's why we strap the infants down, because this is exceedingly traumatic. They don't use an anesthetic, and even if they use it, it doesn't work very well, and they have the brain scans to prove that as well. But scientifically, when we do this, we have destroyed this prefrontal cortex and the ability to do long-term planning and decision-making. Any of the women that are out there that are married to their husbands, you can probably empathize with how bad many husbands are with their planning and follow-through. And we kind of have to hold their hand through a bunch of different areas. Like I'm terrible with it, and impulsive, and we get bad ideas in our head all the time. So that's one of the things that happens with it. The big one that happens is the gyrus, the anterior gyrus, and the amygdala, which are responsible for emotional processing and very specifically anger. They light up like light bulbs. And so these are very, very key regions of the brain as well that get destroyed. And so we take a look at the emotional incompetency of many men, my age or whatever age these days. Men are horribly emotionally incompetent. Like we're not great with it. Let's be real here. I have really high levels of psychological androgyny from my mercury toxicity and my piano playing and all the other things that I do. So mine has come back online a whole lot more. But the emotional processing is drastically altered and diminished after the circumcision, because the circumcision hardwires this brain for anger, fear, and aggression from this trauma, and shuts off the emotional processing. We'll get into the death feign and the relation to ADHD and autism and stuff later. And another place that gets hit very hard is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is what is used to encode short-term memories into long-term memory. A lot of men out there, we have very poor short-term memory for a lot of different things. Sports stats, maybe not. I don't know a single sports stat at all, but so, there's a lot of wives will go out there and be like, how many times do you have to remind your husband to do something, like bring out the friggin' garbage? It's not that hard. Well, for men, unfortunately, we've been physically crippled through this, and there's a generational trauma that will be passed on as well, because traumas are stored genetically. They can be passed on for over 14 different generations. So as this happens successively to men, we get this degradation, and the emotional trauma stacks upon itself. So we then get into the science on this isn't exactly perfect, but a logical thinking, rational person can wrap their head around this, that the intimacy levels of a man's ability to engage in actual intimacy versus just going through the motions is drastically disabled, because to be able to connect to your partner completely and wholly during the course of intercourse, the action of intercourse, it's supposed to be the basari had, which is the Hebrew way to say the one flesh. Biblically, it'd say, the man and woman become one flesh. Well, the thing is, when we have all of this brain locked up in trauma, we can't emotionally connect with our partners, because we can't access those regions of the brain due to trauma. So we're unable to use those, and that is, a lot of men, this is one of the beautiful things we say, men, listen, this topic is not a lot of fun, and believe me, going through the emotional detox it sucks, but to be able, the ability though for your intimacy to increase with your partner, and your ability to connect and experience, that merging of the one flesh with your partner is so worth it, to be able to bring that intimacy up to not just going through the motions, and the porn is a weapon as well that piggybacks with the circumcision, that it's just that animalistic, barbaric, just domineering. It's like, that is not intimacy, and that is not lovemaking. That is disgusting, is what that is. And so those all piggyback together with each other to this destruction of intimacy that gets in the way of partners. And then also we move into the body shaming aspect of it, because an infant who's strapped down and basically has a very large section of their most sensitive area removed, the only way that an infant can logically rationalize this, because even me, if you were to strap me down and do something like that, as an adult, my rational capacity to understand what was going on would be very poor. But for an infant, the only thing that they could rationalize is say, there's something wrong with my body, and that's the reason that this got cut off. And so it's this form of body shaming. And so now the genitals for men, we can look at this societally very well, of saying, look at how poorly men treat their reproductive area. There's no respect for it in so many ways. It's very simple to say, put a couple of beers in a single guy out at the bar and watch the display of the beta male agenda of, look at my beer muscles, look at the stupid ideas I get in my head to impress women because I feel I need to. And then also their willingness to basically bring home anything at bar close after you get a few beers in them, because that subconscious program of I'm damaged goods is always running, and it takes over and displays itself. So there's this whole subconscious program of the body shaming and the lack of intimacy and the inability to emotionally connect, emotionally process. The planning and decision making is destroyed. Also, there's a very key area, because properties like mathematics and linguistics are a very masculine-based trait, which are in the left side of the brain, and the workies and Broca's area, which is where language, linguistics, and higher-level mathematic processing is located. It also disables that region of the brain, because we've basically attacked the very masculine aspect of a man. Like, the most masculine aspect that there is basically the genitals. And if we attack that, it also not only emotionally plays out, but as far as logic and decision-making and the planning, and then this higher-level mathematics and linguistics also gets disabled as well. So there's that damaging aspect that comes into it. So the actual physical damage in the brain will be displayed not just emotionally, but the ability to process mathematics, language, linguistics, as well as the physical planning of these other different things. Now, can this be overcome? Neuroplasticity, yes, but instead of creating a generation of broken men and children and in men's bodies that need to be healed and fixed, we could instead raise children who aren't broken from the very beginning. And that's a little bit of the first part of the science with it, and that's just the reality that we have to come to accept with. And I guess this is a really good spot for me to kind of share my last couple of days of detoxing this trauma. I've had a very difficult time my entire life being able to make decisions, plan ahead, and then stick with those decisions after I've made them, which is the prefrontal cortex. The mercury damage obviously is a problem with that as well. But then the circumcision trauma is, I've had a very, very, very large problem with that. And then there's obviously the anger that's been buried. I had to go basically sit by myself as I worked out some of these things in the emotional processing and in the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe of the brain, we find if people get damaged to the temporal lobe of the brain, drastic personality changes are usually a result, because that person loses their I am of who they are, because the region of the brain that's responsible for self-realization is damaged, and circumcision causes very large amounts of trauma to that area. So all of these kids that are being circumcised are disconnecting themselves heavily from themselves and who they actually are. And that now allows for them to be societally programmed much more easily, just like there's the trauma-based mind control in Disney movies of the parents always dying, because that's trauma-based mind control. So basically, the more dissociated from themselves a person is, the more readily and easily they will accept the programming that comes in externally, because they don't know who they are internally. So I kind of have to, I go through this motion a lot right now, and a lot of people that follow me, I bless you for putting up with me as I'm I'm trying to find this actual internal self, and so I'm putting on all of these hats and trying to find the pieces of it that are actually me and integrate it. But, you know, I'm 37 years old. To have to go through this process of finally saying, I was telling my wife last night, I'm like, I have such a problem because, you know, it's almost like an identity crisis of I can't really get a handle on myself because I don't even know who myself is because I've never met myself. All this trauma is in the way and I'm so dissociated from it that I'm trying to find it, but it's difficult to stay in it because I've been so disconnected from birth of who the internal me and who the I actually is that it makes it really hard to say, well, you know, to create do a Facebook persona and profile because I don't want to just create a fake one. I'd like it to be me. But the problem is at the same time, I've been so disconnected for 37 years of my life that's very tough to find who actually am I, because I know I have certain predominant traits of myself that come out, but then there's also these other aspects that are just, they're masks that I wear and put on and I don't like it. So it's, you know, a very frustrating thing for me to go through and be like, well, this isn't me, but I don't even know who me is to get past this trauma and this anger. And like, I had to go leave the kids because I was like sitting there crying. I'm like, I gotta go. Like, I wasn't like outwardly crying a lot, but I got like just tears coming down my face that I'm like stuffing back. I'm like, Carrie, I gotta just leave. And she's like, you know, bless her heart. She was as patient as possible. And she's like, you know, it isn't always about you. And I'm like, this is not helping my amygdala with my anger processing right now. I need to leave. So I had to go and just basically work through it. And it was, you know, it's difficult. It was tough and it sucked. But, you know, it's part of the process that if I want to emotionally connect, if I want to be there for my kids as a whole me, as a fully loving, you know, father who can be present with their children, I've got to go through this stuff. And so we're going to kind of move to the, unless you've got anything to throw in there, we'll move into the next topic.
No, I think that if that's the worst of it in how you're dealing with it, I think most women would be okay with their husbands needing to go through a bit of a, you know, crisis in life and do what you're doing to better yourself versus like leaving and coming home with like the top down, you know, convertible, like, oh yeah,
it's sort of a midlife
like
crisis,
or
breaking up the family to go find some, breaking up the family to go find some 20-year-old or whatever because you know, because that's not healthy. I mean, filling the void with material things that's not going to fix it. And I've been avoiding this for a very long time because they found scientifically as well, people that will have damage to the prefrontal cortex are far have a far greater risk of being addicted to drugs. And I had, or just addictions, period, which I had lots of addictions throughout the course of my life. Alcoholism, I used to smoke a ton of pot, used to smoke a ton of cigarettes, used to drink way too much coffee, a gallon of Diet Coke a day, sugar, so I used to eat a pound of peanut butter M&Ms. You know, I used to be 300 pounds and all these other things. So my propensity, the addictiveness in my personality because of this damage, the mercury toxicity and the circumcision, was off the charts. And so I'm still dealing with this stuff of the addictive level personality of saying, well, listen, that personality, listen, I'm an addict, but that's not me. That's because there's this malfunction that's happened that I have to rewire. And so, and you know, my poor wife, she's trying her best to understand that she's dealing with the kids, and I'm telling her I got to go run off and be by myself and deal with this. And she's like, well, can you explain to me what it even feels like? And I'm trying to tell her, I'm like, honestly, it just sucks. Like, this blows. There's no other, I hurt. Like, my head hurts, my heart hurts, my everything, my hair hurts. I don't know what's going on, and I'm pissed off, and I don't like it, and I just got to disappear. So I had to go, you know, play some, I've got a bunch of crystal singing bowls. That's my coping mechanism, playing piano as I go do some really weird hippie stuff. But it works wonderfully. It's a great way to center myself, and it's a very healthy way to do it versus I'm going to go buy a stupid expensive convertible or go find myself a 20-year-old to run off with and destroy the family of it. I'll take the hippie route. Be like, you say what you want, fine. I'll take the crystal singing bowls. But one of the other things that they found as well with this, and this is a really big thing, we're going to switch to the next level of science. And this is just basically to warn parents about this stuff, to say, listen, this science is solid and concrete of the reasons not to circumcise. So no matter what in the world they say as far as like, oh, the cleanliness and the infections. Well, number one, the infections happen because improperly trained doctors tell you to retract the foreskin prematurely. So now it gets infected because it's retracted before it was supposed to. Yeah, that's the reason that's That would be the reason that there's any increase in our child, is intact and like little boy. It's so easy, it's stupid to take care of. You just kind of wipe it off and it takes care of itself until it's ready to retract on its own. Don't retract it prematurely. There's a lot of idiot doctors out there that say, oh yeah, as soon as you can, start retracting. It'd be like, no, number one, that's painful for the kid. Number two, now you're going to infect the thing. And so it's like just these doctors have no idea. Then they're telling parents this stuff. And it's causing all of this harm because these terrorist organizations are basically putting this really shitty information out. Decrease in STDs, absolutely nowhere even true. Like, those studies are so flawed and so ridiculous, it's not even funny. They tried to say that, yeah.
Statistically, sorry, would you know statistically, I guess, amount of deaths in America via circumcision, and then not just the deaths, but also the really avoidable side effects?
I want to say that circumcision kills like 130 boys a year. I want to say it's like 100 or 132, which...
Because they bleed out? Is it mostly because they bleed out?
Yeah, I think they end up bleeding out, or even just the trauma kills them. Like, it literally, because it's so traumatic, they die from trauma, that you can die from that. So it could be those, and I don't know what the statistics of infections are. I don't have them off the top of my head. I just know that whatever they are, they're so bogus because of the retracting the foreskin before it's supposed to be. And then the STD ones are all ones that were basically done in like Africa. They took a group of adult males and then they'd circumcise some, saying, hey, this is going to protect you from STDs. So they're like, okay, well, I would like that because AIDS is prevalent here and other stuff. I'd like that. Well, then they followed up like 16 weeks later to see who had STDs. It's like, well, the thing is, the control group wasn't even able to have sex for 8 weeks. So, of course, the ones that are circumcised are going to have less STDs because they could only have sex for half of the time because they were out of the game for 8 of the 16 weeks in your follow-up study. So, well, of course they're going to have lower rates because they couldn't have sex for half the time. So this is how they make this flawed data to push the stuff out. Just like vaccine science. It's garbage. It's complete manipulation and nonsense, but I digress. So those are, unfortunately, people would have to look those up to say what are the actual rates of death rates, and just understand that they're so flawed it's not even funny. Moving into even more science of this, though, and this gets really neat, this part, to start looking into, I guess neat is a very relative word, but one of the studies that came out, there was a Danish study of over almost 350,000 boys. They studied the rates of autism and ADD and ADHD in circumcised versus uncircumcised boys. And they found that the circumcision group had over double the risk of autism than the intact group did. So all of the circumcision kids had double the risk of autism, and we'll come to some science on this in a sec. But they also found, and they weren't expecting to find this, but a logical person would say that trauma through dissociation, this is very logical. They found that there was a far, far, far greater risk in the circumcised group of the kids being diagnosed with ADD and ADHD. So for a pharmaceutical company, circumcision is a wet dream because look at all the meds that autistic kids are on, the ADD, the ADHD drugs. They've now got customers for life. This anterior gyrus as well is also a serotonin dopamine receptor site of reward versus pleasure. So now, if we can cause this trauma from an early age, then how much depression can we cause later in life to sell antidepressant drugs? And this reward pleasure thing wires you for addiction, all this stuff. So, I mean, this circumcision makes you a really, really big pharmaceutical customer by the odds. So that's one of the huge reasons that, like, say, the FDA, the CDC, the AMA, the AAP, they promote this because these agencies are terrorist organizations that work for the very companies that they're supposed to protect us from. So any logical person taking a look at, the science of the trauma that's caused by these and by the rates of autism, the rates of ADD, ADHD from this one single thing, that all of that data very, very clearly outweighs you would have to have an astronomical level of infections or STD prevention, which don't exist, in order for any doctor to say this is a good idea, come do this. The religious programming of it is, we're just going to kind of put a pin in that, and we're going to say, listen, no matter what your religion is, I'm not here to attack it, but we need to look at this as a rational thinking adult, that no matter what a book says of Old Testament or whatever else, when we know it causes this much damage, it's not a good idea. Like, we know this. So when you know better, you do better. Be a rational thinking adult of saying, we can look at the gigantic quantities of trauma that this causes, that please entertain that maybe this is not a good idea, no matter what something says. I mean, take a picture or take a look at, try to get a video or even look at the pictures of any child being strapped down and then being circumcised and tell me this is a good idea. It's not, but we're just going to pin in that.
That's exactly it, though. Most parents will not and cannot watch. They can't watch. You know, most moms, they send the husbands in, and then it's the same story. The husband almost faints, you know, can barely make it through.
Irrationally so.
It's barbaric. And you tell somebody, look, there's a lot of it. You can go on yourwholebaby.org and you can watch the circumcisions. You can see it if you can put yourself through it, because
yeah,
I couldn't even finish a video.
No, if something like that was happening to my child, I would murder everybody in the room, of not just the person doing it, but the bystanders, being like, what the is wrong with you? Like, how did it, well, and so we'll move into the next piece of the science with it, because there'll be this whole, oh, well, you know,